All right, well, welcome to the virtual lecture series, The Book Past, Present, and Future, hosted by the Robert C. Williams Museum of Papermaking in conjunction with the Wildlife Guild of Bookworkers exhibition. We got some funding from the Georgia Humanities Council for this lecture series, and we will be in conversation with Dr. Jesse Erickson from the University of Delaware. But before I introduce him, I'd just like to tell you a little bit more about the Robert C. Williams Museum of Papermaking. We're located in Atlanta, Georgia, on the campus of the Georgia Institute of Technology. And our mission is to collect, preserve, increase, and disseminate knowledge about papermaking, past, present, and future. We have 4 exhibition spaces and with permanent exhibition spaces, and then 2 changing exhibits. 1 classroom, and we do programming for ages 5 and up. We have approximately 100,000 artifacts, 7,000 books in our collection. We're in for a great talk tonight. Dr. Jesse Erickson is the coordinator of special collections and digital humanities, assistant professor in the Department of English in the College of Arts and Sciences, and associate director of the Interdisciplinary Humanities Research Center at the University of Delaware. He previously worked as a bibliographic researcher and archival processor in the manuscripts division of the Charles E. Young Research Library and the Center for Oral History Research at the University of California. He recently served as the vice president for programs for the American Printing History Association. Currently, he serves on the editorial boards of the University of Delaware Press and Publishing History, and he is the co-editor for the Papers of Bibliographical Society of America. His research specializations are in ethnobibliography, alternative printing, non-canonical textuality, African American print culture, and the transnational publishing history of the works of Ouida. Join me in welcoming Dr. Jesse Erickson.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Okay, so this talk will be about the Book of the Present, and I'm situating the Book of the Present in the larger milieu of postmodernism. Of all the predictions of the printed book's demise in the digital age, printed books and the cultures that have been shaped around them persist in ways that have defied the direst prognostications. After more than a decade of these takes, the prophecies have become somewhat of a cliché. Yet the persistence of this particular bibliographical format compels us to question not simply the underlying root of this resiliency, but the fundamental concept of the book and what it represents in relation to temporality. Such questions have interested me, by extension, insofar as they concern the purpose of those library collections specifically invested in the preservation of antiquarian books. However, the book as an object persists not only because of its conceptual coherence, that is, something to be read, but also as a consequence of its material fluidity. And granted, this coherence allows for some stability. Nevertheless, the stability of the book as a concept offers each generation the opportunity to redefine it in defiance of the very fixity that would calcify its obsolescence. The teleological rhetoric constructing the paradigm of print's inevitable decline was always paradoxically necessitated by the need to set a watermark on deterministically driven material shifts in human textual relations, and made fruitless by that same dynamism that is quintessentially characteristic of an ever-changing present. In order for me to probe the nature of the Book of the Present, I must first stake a claim on my relationship to the present as I understand it. The present, of course, is a reductive representation of one's relationship to temporality. Accepting as a presupposition that time itself is a force that exists independent of a person's experience of it. We know it as the here and now, and yet it is always here and now. Even as the mind imagines the past, either in reflecting on one's own past experience or in constructing a mental model of a history outside of the lived experience, and even as the mind contemplates the future, either in planning something out for one's own life or in speculating on what the world has in store for future generations, the cognitive register of the temporal forgery is occurring in the here and now. So, fundamentally, I'm adopting the frame of presentism in how I look at the book of the current moment. As H. Scott Hestefold and William R. Carter illustrate in their analysis of presentism as a philosophical doctrine, this way of thinking first posits that time itself exists, which is an assertion that is not held without scrutiny in the discourse on its metaphysical soundness. After that, Hestefold and Carter maintain that since presentism, quote, implies that only that which presently exists or occurs in an irreducibly non-tenseless sense enjoys privileged ontological status, one should leave open the possibility that that which presently exists or occurs has undergone or is undergoing, in some sense, temporal becoming, end quote. Dichotomized is the notion of how we experience temporality. One, in the framing of presentism, a form of quote-unquote transient time, where the past and future are always seamlessly, tenselessly flowing through a present moment's instantiation, as opposed to the other, a form of quote-unquote static time, where tense states of time exist as discrete, ephemeral, and divisible units. Presentism, then, sees present time, or transient time, as becoming. The actualizing principle inherent to the act of becoming is correspondingly inherent to the term contemporary. The book of the present is a contemporary book. It is the book of the current moment that is always coming into being. Contemporary, I should note, supplanted the term modern as a descriptor for the quality of newness. The shift occurred at the same time that postmodernism saw its emergence as the only rational means for paradigmatically moving beyond the perpetual self-actualizing of modernity, that is, the crisis of the postulation that there could be nothing newer than that which is modern. Yet even postmodernism has, through its own perpetual mode of becoming, actualized beyond itself ad infinitum, leaving the contemporary intact in a newer paradigm of postmodernism. Gene Thompson noted, quote, if you can wrap your mind around the concept of postmodernism, a term that seems ready to burst into spores like a wet mushroom, then I suppose you can understand the need to push and prod and coax the culture into new exciting trends that have not really happened yet, end quote. A constructionist redefining that shifts paradigms and propels change in the present instantiation of discursive thought is constantly happening, as in, for example, with the delivery of this position paper on the book of the present. For, in the words of Jeffrey T. Nealon, quote, postmodernism marks an intensification and mutation within postmodernism, which in its turn was of course a historical mutation and intensification of certain tendencies within modernism, end quote. And all mutation maniacally confronting postmodernity's inherent claim of its interminable end to all variety of social and cultural phenomena. The book of the present, then, is a postmodern book. It is not that the features that used to define it have disappeared. Static time would necessitate the chronological discreteness of each period in the history as defined by certain technocultural characteristics. In transient time, not only is manuscript culture intertwined with print, it lives with print in the digital as well. The features are mutated and intensified as the present continues to instantiate it. The intensification, too, of course, is a market-driven phenomenon, part of the, quote, global intensification of capitalism, end quote, in the exchange of culture and commodities engendered and operant in globalism. It seems that in this intensification, which swallows craft and creativity into consumer branding, and the consumer's interminable desire to consume, there is a blurring of the lines between culture and commodity. William Morris and others in the arts and crafts movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries first witnessed this intensification and resisted it. In an almost Etsy-like fashion, their interventions, too, have been commodified by the same forces that brought their work into existence. And think not only of the cheap American Caxton editions from Belford Clark and Company, but of the more recent H&M deal with Morris and Company. So now, from Amazon to print on demand to online fan communities, books and what they mean to us culturally are increasingly entangled with their status as commercial objects in a vast network of commercial industries. The end result has given us celebrity-sponsored book clubs marketed through smartphone apps, and celebrity-curated monthly book subscriptions marketed through social media platforms and profiles of influencers. The vastness of these networks is becoming too complex for us to be able to construe and dissect each unique layer of manufacture, production, distribution, reception, and so on comprehensively, especially as the algorithmic qualities of bibliographic commerciality are increasingly processed through artificial intelligence. R.E. Hawley touched on this phenomenon in her September 23, 2021 print magazine article titled, "Behold the Book Blob." In the article, Hawley writes about how contemporary cover design uses algorithmic logic to maximize the market potential of selling books in a hybrid digital/brick-and-mortar marketplace. The result, according to Hawley's analysis, is the limitless repackaging of sameness, creating new possibilities for variance within a standard design template that can be remixed over and over again like samples in an EDM track. The postmodern book actualizes a dialectical collapse of sorts. The visibility of modernity's power structures in the global body politic are obscured by the commodification of the reader as a data set. As an idea, the book of the past be a stand-in for preserving tradition, as a means by which history and culture could be passed on to new generations. Alternatively, the conceptual book of the future is compelled to situate itself in terms of possessing at least the possibility of ushering in revolutionary change. The book of today must do both, or it can do neither, as long as it does so in a way that can be subsumed by the exchanges of market consumption. That globalizing force is the connective thread whether one chooses to embrace it or resist it. Jeffrey W. Robbins, in his book Radical Theology, A Vision for Change, writes, and I quote at length, "Globalization functions as a kind of hypermodernism and thus as an extension of colonialism. The world is interconnected by a single interconnected global economy. The colonial matrix of power is nearly complete. Yet although this world is economically interconnected, there remains a diversity of political theories, practices, and institutions. Capital functions as a trans or supranational sovereign power, with almost no one or nothing capable of keeping it in check." End quote. The description of globalization as the intensification of colonialism, coupled with how capital functions as an uncheckable actualizing force, rings symptomatic of late-stage capitalism, a term that suggests that capitalism itself will shift toward its own teleology. Within borders, the microcosm of this relationship to capital is as mutable as the present, just as there is a huge ethical and socio-political gulf that separates shareholder capitalism from an arguably more humane stakeholder variety. At the macro level, across borders, again, operating through that globalization, such distinctions dissolve in the metamorphosis of colonialism and the insidious machineries of misogyny and anti-blackness. The book of the past was once both a symbol of and a justification for the expansion of colonialism through conquest. But globalism must not conquer and force us to participate, at least not openly. It must instead seduce us to consume. The present-day book, in this context, reimagines itself. In other words, it refashions itself through that same commodity function in its post- and decolonial image. Imagining the aftermath of colonialism in this way is a strategic manipulation of chronology. It is similar to the impulse that has brought about the pop cultural phenomenon of retrofashion, sustaining the old as the prevailing trend where oldness transforms to newness in the eyes of a new generation. It reminds us that the eyes of a new generation can still look toward the future while fetishizing certain aspects of the past. The impulse to stare at time bidirectionally, like Janus, creates the aesthetic of retrofutures. Similar to the ways in which the Kelmscott Press started entirely new trends in the book arts by looking back to the past and refashioning it, there is a retrofuturism to contemporary bookishness. Both as the pinnacle of tradition and as the cutting edge of what is to come, in theory, we could have made print's obsolescence more salient. Instead, as a society, we've opted to defy the determinism of technology in the agency of our own presentism. Print's obsolescence, therefore, is no less real than that of reading a book on Web 1.0 or even on 2.0. Just as a printed book printed with an iron press or even a Van der Kook proofing press is no less obsolete than one printed on a factory-grade Wisprint WS D625 book printing system. And the letterpress, now, is at once high and low. It is hipster and proletariat. It is artistic and chic. Retrofuturism, an idea central to the time-filled distortion of subaltern literary punk cultures, for example, steampunk and cyberpunk and dieselpunk, etc., is not the antithesis to presentism's hypermodernity. It is the epitome of it. A retrofuture crafts and molds concepts of past and future into the present moment. Post-Colonial anachronisms of retrofuturism, in the words of Diana M. Foe, quote, posits the re-examination of dominant historical narratives in the Western canon to embrace cultural hybridity and challenge the traditional power dynamics of national identity, end quote. The retrofuturism of the postmodern book is a response to the dynamism of globalization. It affords a sense of playful agency to a dispossessed and minoritized readership in its hypermodernity. As Ralph C. Wood describes it, quote, hypermodernism emerges as a form of postmodernism where autonomous individuals create their own identities by fulfilling whatever needs and choosing whatever pleasures they prefer, end quote. That identity construction, largely through one's social media presence, becomes integral to the development of one's brand, and if so preferred, the violence of colonialism's historicity can be deconstructed and rendered in a new anti-racist image with the aesthetic largely unscathed. This form of historical appropriation is something different than the subaltern mimicry of the colonizer, first articulated in the writings of Homi K. Bhabha. The spirit of strategic playfulness is the same, but the relationship to chronology differs substantially insofar as there is an acquiescence to the temporal acceleration that manifests itself as a calculated aesthetic reversion. As chronology falls apart in the postmodern book, so too does narrative integrity. Contrary to the obvious conclusion of this condition, the loss of narrative integrity is not inherently destructive. It can be as constructive as those paradigms that privilege narrative integrity as a means of social cohesion. The constructive nature of narrative discordance lies in its propensity to be reconfigured again and again according to a person's individual proclivities. It allows for the continuous creation of new narratives, what I'm calling nano-narratives, that speak more to personal affect than those narrative arcs that function on a grander scale. It produces literary mashups that combine romantic fiction with horror, history with science fiction, fandom with fantasy and fashion, critical fabulations and the like. And with narrative integrity compromised, the postmodern book eats away at its own linearity. Now, my son often adopts a non-linear approach to reading. He's only 5, but I first noticed this preference when I would read children's books to him. And he would insist on my going back to one page or another and having me reread a particular page over and over again, and then prompting me to advance back and forth to different parts of the story as he saw fit. Now, he opened my eyes to the dimensions of non-linearity in my own reading practice that I had previously overlooked. I've started books that I've never finished. I've reread passages from books that I've never finished, meaning that I've essentially finished books that I've never started. I've read parts of a series in the form of textual content and watched other parts in the same series in televised or cinematic adaptation. James Mussel, in his study on the digital scholarship of the 19th century press, suggests that, quote, We have never really read in a linear fashion, word by word, sentence by sentence, and one work at a time, end quote. Still, there does appear to be a certain degree of linearity built into the structure of printed books, from their pagination to the narrative arcs. That same linearity, however illusory, has established a powerful foothold in the pedagogies of literacy and close reading. The postmodern environment twists and warps this linearity in its propensity to accelerate the temporal experience of reading. In the current moment, linearity is only important to the degree that it aligns with the reader's preference for the experience of a linear approach to textual consumption. Present-day video games are particularly illustrative of this new relationship to narrativity, as they can arguably be seen as some of the most bookish objects of the postmodern era. In these games, which are really stories, one can opt to play an open-world platformer storyline to its conclusion, but be just as entertained wandering through the game's universe aimlessly, while creating their own storyline along the way. On the whole, as with narrative integrity, it is no longer mandatory to conform to a shared sense of linearity in the reading experience in adherence to a culturally shared arc of narrativity that will affect transfiguration through the completion of a text. The goal is actually the inverse. It is to conform narrativity to the interiority of personal experience in support of one's personal identity as expressed to the outside world. In other words, one's brand. This remixed, nonlinear mashup of textuality liberates itself from the illusion of a fixed, linear reading experience that grounds the reader in a shared understanding of chronology. Each composite of each breakdown helps to define the nebulous liminality of the postmodern book in transient time. In eras past, if you were fortunate enough to be among the literate, you read this book and that one, and you tied them to a larger collective narrative shared by some combination of empire, nation, and/or religion. Today, you binged a trilogy by your favorite author, but you did so in part because the author's particular brand augmented your own. You could have read the last book in the series first, skipped the second, or read the first one last. You assembled bits of Karl Marx and Noam Chomsky into a quasi-philosophical collage, but you never read an entire book written by either of these authors. You wove together fragments of Toni Morrison, bell hooks, and the Bible into an intricate quilted worldview, but you read all of one and little of the others. You consumed works as textual commodities along such lines because you felt comfortable configuring them into that transient sense of becoming that which is always defining who you believe yourself to be. And then you curated that identity for your social media presence. The special collections libraries of today anticipates the future with hopes of preserving a past that will be relevant to an always emerging new generation of readers and researchers. Once premised upon the distinctiveness of the tactility of the in-person research experience, Special Collections Library of today finds itself engaged in the polychronicity of doing multiple things at once digital and non-digital, in its in-person and remote instruction, in its digital mediation, its gallery exhibits and online catalogs, in its reading rooms, on-site and virtual. It must anticipate the future, with one foot always in the past, in this notion of history. And in that anticipation, it must reckon both with the various streams of consumer consumption and their impact on access and service models, as well as with the active resistance to some of those same traditions, a resistance that works to expose and confront exclusionary educational models founded upon white supremacy and colonialism. The Book of the Past, as a symbol, was viewed as an object of knowledge, truth. The Book of the Present does not enjoy that same designation. Its truthiness is no longer a given, even when it's marketed as such. And under this new regime of uncertainty, the so-called quote-unquote information age, has transformed into an era of digital disinformation. Information can be theoretically less empirically true than the epistemological authority of information contained in an academic book or a journal. Yet, when presented, perhaps in a tweet or a TikTok or a Facebook post, it can market itself as being truer than its scholarly competitor through the strength of the influencer combined with that of the platform. On the other hand, newer social media sources of information can also serve to expose in real time the hidden structures of power that underlie academic discourse. Consequently, the special collections librarians of today can no longer exclusively position themselves as the gatekeepers of historical sources of truth to be discovered by the rigors of scholarship. Knowledge production must compete in a literal marketplace of ideas, where virtually anyone, regardless of their perceived authority as an expert, can build up a platform and establish their brand as an expert within a particular information domain. The shift, then, causes books to become symbols of personal agency, or as a means by which bits of source material can be attained so that they can be mixed and remixed into new intersectional nano-narratives in support of the brand. For many in this new generation of readers, those same readers that special collections librarians are constantly searching for better methods of marketing to, their personal brands are closely tied to personal arcs of resistance. The nano-narrative arcs, of course, connect to larger themes and global issues. Nevertheless, the acts of resistance are more often than not isolated to an individual's engagement with the narrative through their personal brand, again, as mediated through social media platforms. The resistance targets contemporary manifestations of forms of oppression that were established through socioeconomic and cultural conditions of past modernity. The resistance is typically enacted as a means of building a better future. Activist hashtag campaigns are the current locus of social change. The nature of the postmodern book, then, has positioned the reader and their literacy practice in the milieu of activism and change. During the peak of the racial reckoning, which spread rapidly across the nation in the summer of 2020, there was a sudden sharp rise in demand for literature by and about Black Americans and American race relations. Some in the Black Lives Matter movement turned to the promotion of reading as a fresh outlet for their organizing. And others were able to publish their own books on the current movement and capitalize from their anti-racist work in support of their personal brand. However, given the intensification of commercialization in the global book market, new generations of activists that have gone down this road have had to reckon with their own relationship to capitalism, a political system largely viewed as being deeply interconnected with structural racism. Rapper and activist No Name born Fatima Naima Warner, for example, who started an activist-oriented book club, publicly grappled with this predicament in a tweet, and I'll quote at length. She stated, "I hate that me advocating for reading makes me come off as elitist to some people. Our relationship to literature shouldn't have anything to do with class, but it does because of capitalism. Everyone should be able to freely access books. That's why I partner with libraries." End quote. Again, the situation represents somewhat of an intellectual conundrum for a special collections librarian or an archivist, as this is a profession that has spent entire generations building its own brand on a very conservative preservation of tradition. So that intellectual conundrum exerts a push and pull effect on professionals as they attempt to realign their practice to meet the demands of change. This particular conundrum adds yet another layer upon the existing challenges of adapting to the post-digital and its born digital bibliographical artifacts. Revisiting for one last time the tired conversation of the complicated relationship between digital and print, the postmodern book defies the binary divisions based on format and mediation and encourages an embrace of bibliographical hybridity. For years, proponents of the generational divide argued that book reading and print culture would plummet with the maturation of millennials, and by extension Gen Z, especially among those considered quote-unquote digital natives. The thinking has been that the younger generations, having a greater familiarity and technological adeptness with new media, would lose interest in printed information as it became more and more obsolete. In certain respects, particularly with newspapers and other periodicals, there is some validity to certain aspects of this reductive characterization. In the ensuing years, however, since this way of thinking first emerged, a different story has been unfolding. We find, for instance, according to a 2016 Pew Research study, that quote unquote young adults are no more likely than older adults to be digital-only book readers, and that only 6% of Americans were digital-only book consumers. A September 2021 follow-up survey showed that the percentage of the population who claimed not to have read a book in the past year was higher among the 50-plus demographic than it was for the 18 to 49-year-old group. So one can safely surmise, then, that digital and print and other modes of textual consumption have and will continue to exist in a shared textual universe that merges a variety of forms of textual encoding for market consumption. And yet, the myth of a divide still informs much of our thinking around the temporality of bookishness, which, in turn, has an impact on the ways in which we conduct our professional practice. The postmodern book challenges us to see the interconnectedness not just of different reading modalities, but also different forms of textual encoding and mediation. Evoking Jerome McGann's, what he calls materialist hermeneutics, in looking at the text as a product of essentially material relationships, Mussel offers a rather compelling description of print that focuses on its encoding functionality, and I'll quote at length. This is a lengthy quote. Print encodes text in a material object that is manipulated by the hands of the reader, but read with the eye. Even linguistic information must be encoded within visual material, whether letters or words, sentences or paragraphs, so that it can be read. Printed objects, then, employ a repertoire of visual codes that present different types of information. This is what presents different types of information to the reader. Images, where they appear, are an important part of the visual field, but they are situated among a broader range of visual materials that include symbols and icons, links and type, and the appearance of the page itself. So in essence, a text is produced through all of its codes. And I'll end that quote. The same encoding functionality present in non-digital text can also be found in digital text. What distinguishes them is the material systems of encoding and display. The differences are not as stark as we often make them out to be, but our use of such language as virtual, cyberspace, and the cloud to obfuscate the materiality of digital encoding is what effectively creates the binary between the physical printed book and a virtual electronic one. I remember that when I first entered graduate school, I used to consider rather naively that the possibility that rare books would become even more important in the future with the ascendance of digital text. The premise suggests that essentialist binary that an ebook is not a real book, or at least not one existing in physical reality. The logic can be extended to digital surrogates of antiquarian books, whether of manuscripts or early printed works. The focus is almost always on all that is lost in the migration of encoded mediation. Similar arguments, in fact, are being applied to the reformatting of aspect ratio for shows like The Simpsons and Seinfeld and platforms like Netflix and HBO Max. Such changes, however, do not make the context of the remediation any less real. In the art world, the intermixing of digital crafting, creating code, and creating art had very real consequences for a market where born digital artifacts can be sold as non-fungible tokens, NFTs, and traded with cryptocurrency. Paradoxically, the quotidian nature of the digital in contemporary society has prodded artists to consider the possibilities for creating art within a post-digital paradigm. The term refers not to the sense that we have moved beyond the digital, but that the digital has become so embedded in daily life with both the internet and the Internet of Things that we can look at our human-computer interactions through more of a critical lens. As David M. Barry and Michael Dieter suggest in discussing a new asterism, quote, the everyday experience of life within computer societies inspires a search for new concepts and experiences, or perhaps formal indicators, as vague neologisms, in an attempt to historically delimit and define the present. Accordingly, in different ways, notions such as post-internet, post-digital, and the new aesthetic can be taken as attempts to grapple with the immersive and disorienting experience of computation infrastructure as they scale up and intensify. End quote. Such conversations are relevant to how we think of our practice with respect to the postmodern book. Text-to-speech voiceovers for TikToks, AI influencers, digital clothes for selfies, and deep fakes are tantamount to the preservation of born digital books that never saw print publication. Printing these kinds of books out on a printer or even typesetting them for a printing press would amount to creating a printed facsimile of a digital source. Just as special collections librarians and archivists are pushed to find new ways of preserving the digital objects as source material. And how in the reading room we now find ourselves in an environment where readers commonly snap smartphone photos of the objects they later intend to research through digitally mediated surrogates. The smartphones are just as material as the digital images, and they're just as material as the servers storing the data of their encoding and the energy required to power those servers. So, thinking about the book of the present is a thought-provoking and perplexing prospect. It dares us to consider how we define the nature of the book as a concept, as well as the nature of temporality in our relationship to it. I understand that many of the ideas presented here have been reductive and deterministic, even though I've attempted to shed light on the more reductive aspects of framing things deterministically. Yet, I believe it is important for us to look at the book of the present in the context of the current moment, one that is always unfolding, always becoming in that flow of transient time. I'm reflecting the socioeconomic and cultural changes that are actualizing in tandem with their intrinsic relationship to that flow. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I encourage you all to uh, put your questions in the Q&A. We have one from Jackie. She says, you quoted some healthy statistics about millennials and uh, Gen Z reading non-digital material. Will you please posit some hypotheses about how and why these generations choose whether to read digitally or non-digitally?
That is an excellent question, and it's something that I've thought about before, and I do have an answer for you. I can speculate. I've kind of thought of it in sort of the same vein as the retro fashion phenomenon that I spoke about in my talk, and that is um, there's this sort of tendency to fetishize certain aspects of what we would consider past technology, right? So it's kind of like the mystique of the historicity of the format of printed works um, that attract new generations to it in the way that vinyl attracts new, audiophiles and listeners of music because they want to have the experience that is the sort of, sonic experience that is engendered by listening to music on vinyl as opposed to an MP3 or another form of digital streaming. Um, so I suspect it's similar to that impulse, and this crops up in fashion as well. to where, um, the, as long as you have those bell bottoms in your closet, right, thinking that they'll never be back in style, lo and behold, there they come, back in style again, and sometimes to one's chagrin, but it's interesting to see those cycles play out, and this occurs, decade by decade, and sometimes that reversion can go stretch back quite some time, to where people are pulling in, different aspects from quite some time ago, right? So it really does play with this idea of a fixed chronology, right? That we're, sort of, in our own moment when we're always pulling from eras of the past. But I think there's a certain mystique to print among the new generations, and it's just a different experience, you know. I mean, I'm what they would call like a xennial. So I grew up in that transitional period, and I do remember sort of life before personal computing took over. But there is a different experience, not just with the tactile dimensions of it, but just the way that the eyes read on the page, without the backlight that you get with the screen. But I mean, to be honest, I it's hard for me to imagine an environment where people are just kind of like strictly sticking to one format or another. It seems clear to me that it's much more common for all readers to kind of switch back and forth between one format and another, depending on the situation or, the different, preference at that time. As in, if you're on a plane and you don't want to carry a lot of books with you, you might take that ebook reader or read something on your cell phone or sync on a commute, or perhaps at the beach where you don't want to ruin the technology, you'll bring that print book. So yeah, it's I think it's complex. The answer is complex, but those are the kinds of ideas that I've thought when speculating around that idea.
So we have a question. How do you think the art world's interest in handmade books challenges the digital world you discussed?
I think there's the art world, especially with artist books. Book artists are particularly adept at really exploring a lot of the fundamental concepts that I tried to touch upon in this talk, but doing it through their art, right, through their craft, and using sculptural art forms as applied to the book to really challenge our thinking around what exactly a book can be or what a book is, right? And so there is a certain dimension of wanting to place the book in space, right? Wanting to instantiate it, right? And really experimenting with its form. But it doesn't preclude engagement with the digital, right? I think artist books often do a really good job of really testing our thinking around the concept of a book. But there are certainly, I'm sure you can find examples of artist books that integrate the digital in interesting ways to further challenge our thinking around perhaps that binary between digital and non-digital, physical and virtual, um, because art is a good medium of doing that sort of thing. But yeah, I think that you know there tends to be, at least in my observation of the world of artist books, um, uh, certainly a stronger emphasis on the material production, the craft of producing and manifesting a book in space, right? And using, pulling in different materials and different components to just explore those concepts, right? So yeah, I really appreciate and respect what artists are able to do in that regard.
So you mentioned now we have to kind of consider um, that if something is taken from the digital world and printed, that the printed item is the reproduction, right? So I guess my question is, what is the the value of making those distinctions between um, the digital versus the printed, if the information that you're receiving is the same information. And we're living in a world where people are jumping back and forth between the different forms. What is the value of us continuing to make the distinction between those
Right, right. No,
forms?
that's a really good question. And that's a lot of food for thought. And I'll do my best to kind of, address it as best I can in this setting. But the opening of your question immediately made me think of uh, I early in my career, I was tasked with going through collection files, right, and organizing them. And I watched this transition between um, written letters to letters that were typed out, right, and typed out correspondence, and then eventually when we hit the late 90s and early 2000s, you started seeing emails being printed out, right, and stored in standing files. I thought this was interesting, this kind of phase where people felt it necessary to print out the emails, and it kind of says something about the moment when email was thought to be something that could be contained in that way, as in contained and preserved. It was something that was containable. You could print it out, you could store it in a file, and then you have a comprehensive record. But part of that acceleration experience that I was referring to, that's involved with the proliferation of textuality through the digital medium. Um, it's similar to the way that archivists were trying to like preserve a record of all the tweets, right? And presidential tweets have been printed out. Um, we've since learned that trying to print out all of the digitally formatted text is kind of it's kind of like chipping away at a mountain with a toothpick or something. It's pretty much impossible. But to get at the heart of your question, I think there is a value, even though we seamlessly move through these different modes of textuality as they're mediated in one format or another. I think there's a value to understanding their material instantiation, whether that be through the modes of digital technology or through printed technology, right? And that's part of this wave in the scholarship that's been identified as new materialism, right? Which is kind of run throughout the rise in material culture studies. It definitely is running through contemporary print culture scholarship, in that it's really important to pay attention to the nuances, right, of the material instantiation of a text, right? And um, the I think the key is to understand, and that's why I stress it in not only this talk but in other in previous talks that I've given, is to understand that that digital text are material as well, but it's just about understanding their materiality, and um, and that if you really want to get down to the fundamental sort of level of encoding, that you could actually think about a hard drive as being a disk, right, almost like a ceramic disk, that is where code is being inscribed into it, similar to that of like a cuneiform tablet, right? So these are even though the style of writing is different. Sometimes you may write with a stylus like on a tablet, but oftentimes you're punching in keys. That those punching in of keys is similar to what was done on a typewriter, and after that what was done with on linotype machine, right? So there's all these sort of interesting ways that they overlap and intersect, but it's our task as scholars of text, whether you're a media studies person or a print history person, or into book history or bibliography, to use your expertise to help us to understand um, the technical material differences of each form of mediation.
Just checking to see if we have any other questions in the Q&A. And then you also mentioned that video games being some of the most bookish objects. I love that that as a concept. Um, but again, it almost seems like the definition of the book in present is so broad that a book could be absolutely anything. Like, where do we that does the definition have meaning when it's so broad? Like, are we looking at these video games and saying all of the video games are could be considered books, or only the ones that specifically have more of um, a narrative aspect, even though it's maybe non-linear because you're kind of choosing, um, the choices you make changes the story and the experience as you go along. Um, I don't know if I'm making sense here with this
No,
question, but
you're making perfect sense. And this is really, really a tough question. And I've debated it at length because I don't think there's a clear answer to that. It's pretty much like the slippery slope argument. Once we loosen our, definition of the book, outside of the structure, the more familiar structures of the codex, right? And sometimes we even take it beyond that. Okay, well, not a codex, then codex and scrolls, um, and other material formats. Then it challenges us to set, I guess, conceptual boundaries on how we understand, what a book is, right? And when I referred to video games, I really was talking about the narrativity of them, as in like this is the sort of the the heart of where a lot of our activity of engagement with narratives is occurring, especially among younger generations, right? This is like they're similar to, if you want to look at other cultures that privilege orality over or orature over uh, alphabetic forms of literacy and literature. Um, Video games have become sort of a new site of really kind of like active and fresh storytelling. Um, so in that sense, they're speaking to the narrative function of a text. But the question is a good one, and I don't really have a solid answer for that. I do fall on the side of being, I guess, having a more inclusive definition of what a book could be, right? And see it as tied to the act of reading, however loosely you want to define the act of reading, whether that's interpreting, the images of a book with no alphabetic text or something like that, or a more strict understanding of reading as being tied to the interpretation of textual literacy, right? Um, but yeah, because you could think of a series of tattoos on a human being, as a form of book. If you really expand the definition, it's like where does it end? And then audiobooks. Oh, I love audiobooks because they really throw a wrench in the gears of the way that we understand what a book is, right? And there's even sort of almost like a stigma uh, around, listening to a book. When you say, "Oh yeah, I read that on an audiobook," some readers might be like, "Did you really read it though? Because it was on an audiobook." But um,
yeah.
but no, I mean it counts, right? It's just a different form of taking in the text. At this point, it's sonic information of the textual encoding. Um,
So Jackie's
so
asking, well, in that case, what would you consider not a book? Like, maybe approaching it from the other end instead of trying to define everything that could be considered a book. What would be the distinct thing that is not a book?
well, I would think um, entities, objects, um, uh, and other phenomena that um, have a construction uh, that sets parameters dividing them from being defined as a book, right? That are actively like, we're not a book, right? So, in that sense, they they kind of acquire their own sort of discourse around what they are, right? Um, and people explore them on their own terms. But there is a slippery slope to that because uh, even things like geography, right? In an oral tradition, in an oral tradition of storytelling, one could be from an area where there are all kinds of stories sort of embedded in the land, right? And looking at this mountain and this river, you know, um, each geographical sort of feature in the landscape could have a story to tell, right? Oh, this mountain is has this history to this community. This river has this history to this community, and there could be stories. So the landscape itself could inspire that same sort of literacy function, right? And so can the cityscape, right? So it becomes difficult, but especially when you think about things like graffiti, right? Okay, well, is a building a book? No, not really. But then when there's all kinds of text that can be read on it in that cityscape, then does that cityscape then become form that book function? So I think that there are certain that you know, not everything is a book when it doesn't want to be defined as such, right? It sort of stakes its own claim, like, okay, I'm a painting, interpret me as a painting on my own terms, right? Um, but uh, but when we really kind of loosen our boundaries, our strict boundaries around what a book can be, then it does introduce that slippery slope argument into the discussion. But it's important that we at least entertain it for discussion because otherwise we're excluding all kinds of objects that perform that book function, and then that ties to that cultural, exclusion when we're talking about colonialism and everything, because there are certainly lots of artifacts and objects that not have that haven't taken on the codex form, right? But are read in interesting ways, right? Palm leaf manuscripts don't necessarily look like the books that we're familiar with, and yet, you know, they are considered, they can be considered books. And there's a number of other examples across different cultures where textuality is encoded and inscribed on objects that are not necessarily taking the form of the codex, the printed book or the manuscript that is more familiar to us. That's getting back to like artist books and the way they challenge the way I think about what a book can be. But I don't think there's really like any hard answers to, okay, well, this is a book and that's it, and we get it for all time, or and this is not a book and this can never be a book. Um, I think that's what makes the study of the book so exciting.
Are there any current projects that you're aware of to try to capture some of those uh, structures or uh, more non-traditional, like um, like we were talking about the well, oral histories. People have been collecting those for forever, but things that may have been dismissed as not relevant or are a lower, uh, for lack of a better term, kind of in the hierarchy of colonialism, less valued cultural records that you currently know of that people are trying to capture and save, whether that's like you said, maybe someone going around and um, photographing or capturing the graffiti and trying to analyze and
Right.
record. Like, are there certain projects that you're aware of that are kind of
Uh,
are embracing this broad definition and trying to write that within collections, archives, libraries, those kinds of
Right, right.
places.
I mean, I can, I mean, I have encountered some of these projects in the past. I can't like name them off of memory. I know that they're out there, right? Projects that are dealing with indigenous forms of encoded textuality, um, non-Western forms of encoded textuality. Uh, I know that a lot of bibliographical work that's in the emerging scholarship is interested in expanding outside of the traditional boundaries of Western book history, and that's exciting to me. I very much welcome that. But yeah, I don't have anything that I can cite off memory, unfortunately.
Well, it looks as though we don't have any other questions in the Q&A. Man, you could definitely given me a lot to think about. Oh, there's just so many good um, points that you made here that I'm going to be chewing on for a while. Um, so thank you so much for this presentation. I'm going to do just a little housekeeping. So if you all were had the if this is the first talk that you attended, we did have a previous talk, and that's on our website. You can access that via via our website at paper.gatech.edu. That was Dr. Nick Wilding's talk on the book The Past. And next month, we'll have Dr. Sarah Werner speaking on the book The Future. And also, if you enjoyed this talk and would like to support other programs like this, we have our link to give a donation to the museum so we can continue to give these kinds of experiences free to the public. And then I also just wanted to share our social media with you all. You can go to our website and see Wildlife, the Guild of Bookworkers exhibition that this lecture series is in conjunction with. I encourage you all to check that out. Um, Join us in November for Dr. Warner's discussion. And just thank you.
And thank you all so much. I really appreciated the invitation. It's been a pleasure.
All right. So I bid you all good evening.